What exactly happened? Like, what was the point where the Jews already decided, okay, we need to completely dissociate because the fake news was spreading and they didn't know what to think? At what point did they just decide, okay, this isn't the right thing?
At no point.
Interesting.
This hardcore. So I want to call your attention to a famous work of social anthropology and sociology from the 1950s called "When Prophecy Fails." It actually refers to the Sabbatean movement, among other movements, but it is a study about this phenomenon, which apparently happens in most, if not all, messianic movements, that the sort of less invested people leave the movement when something disproves it, or the date that is expected passes and nothing happens, but that there's a hardcore that stays with it. And so they really explore this phenomenon. They did it before Sholom's book had appeared, so they know only sketchy amounts about the Shabbetai Ẓevi movement, but this is kind of a standard phenomenon. So yes, there is this hardcore. It's not so small either, and there are quite a number of significant rabbis who continue to believe. Shabbetai is eventually exiled to Albania. He dies there in 1676. Nathan of Gaza dies in 1680. And the movement is thrown into chaos, right? It was enough that he was a commandment-breaking Jewish Messiah. Then he became a commandment-breaking apostate Jewish Messiah. And now he's a commandment-breaking apostate dead Jewish Messiah. You would think that would be enough for anybody, right? That, close it down now. But it wasn't. And again, largely because of the Kabbalistic explanations about what was going on, where his soul was, apotheosis, this and that. The Kabbalah is not my department, but it was very convincing especially to rabbis who understood the Kabbalah, right? And Nathan of Gaza was, by all accounts, a super brilliant Kabbalist. And there were others in the movement who were highly respected Kabbalists, and people were studying people who were not followers of Shabbetai Ẓevi were reading Nathan of Gaza's writings well into the 18th century because they were so brilliant as Kabbalah. So anyway, there was quite a group of people who continued to follow the movement even after Shabbetai died. Throughout this period, from the time that Shabbetai himself converted up until the 1680s, here and there were Jews who, in imitation of Shabbetai, converted to Islam, but continued to be followers of Shabbetai secretly. This group became much larger in the early 1680s, and in 1683, they were joined by a quite large group from Saloniki, from Salonika, including leading rabbis of the Salonika Jewish community who converted to Islam, again, as part of their following of Shabbetai Ẓevi. And note that this is after Shabbetai is already dead for 7 years. They convert to Islam, and they are indeed known as the dönme, and they continue to see Shabbetai as the Messiah, and they practice Islam outwardly, and they have a strong bent toward mystical Islam, and secretly they still have all these hymns and ideas concerning Shabbetai, and also in one of the three dönme groups, Osman Baba, who is the leader of that group, Baruchia Russo, right, who's called Osman Baba, he also takes on this sort of heavy messianic role in the group. They are still around. I have been in great contact with quite a number of members of the dönme community. I don't know. It's highly secretive. So when I speak to them, I don't know how much they really know about their own history, about their own doctrines, about their own theology. Maybe they know a tremendous amount. It's hard to tell, but they are still around. Then there are people who stay within the Jewish community and are believers. And a particular person that I'm interested in is an Italian Jew. He's a student of one of the great Kabbalists of the age, a student of Rabbi Moshe Zacuto, and his name is Abraham Rovigo, Rabbi Abraham Rovigo. And his close friend is the rabbi of the city of Reggio, Rabbi Binyamin HaKohen. So these two guys, these two leading rabbis in Italy at the time, were students of Rabbi Moshe Zacuto. And Rabbi Moshe Zacuto is not a believer after maybe believing or being interested for a while at the height of the movement. He is not a believer, but these two students of his are dedicated followers of Shabbetai Ẓevi. And their homes, in particular Rovigo, becomes a center of the movement as you move into the 1670s, 80s, and 90s. So as people are thrown into chaos, what are we supposed to think? He converted, now he died, right around 1676. There are a series of prophets, in particular Baalei Magid, people who have that same kind of Magid spirit speaking to them that we've seen already before in Nathan of Gaza. In the home of Rabbi Avraham Rovigo, these people appear, and he is their mentor and supporter. He's a very wealthy man, and there's several of these people who live with him over many years, and they are prophets who prophesy, what's going to happen next. Is Shabbatai coming back? What's he going to do? How are things going to open up? So that is one center of the movement that continues to support and help people who are believers. People come from all over to visit and exchange news and so on. There's another big center of believers, again, who remain within Judaism and remain observant Jews and Talmidei Hakhamim in many cases in Salonika also, a significant group like that. And then in other towns, in Castoria, in towns all over the Ottoman Empire, all over Italy, and North Africa, there are these sort of cells of people who continue to believe. Right. So the home of Rabbi Avraham Rovigo and his friend Rabbi Binyamin HaKohen of Reggio, these become centers of the Jewish Sabbateans, right? The followers of Shabbatai who remain within the Jewish world. And there are cells like this, there are groups like this all over the place in Italy and North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, and they're in communication with each other. And more Ashkenaz, right, Germany and especially Poland, which had been a little more marginal in 1665, 66, become major centers of the followers, and there are large followings of the movement there. And all these people are in communication. There are people who move back and forth through the communities, including Shlichei Eretz Yisrael, the people who are collecting funds for the Palestinian Jewish communities who go, who are believers and who go from one city to another. Eventually, there is a very large group that is gathered around a figure named Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. This is not Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid of the 13th century, right, of Hasidei Ashkenaz, but a different figure, Rabbi Judah Chassid. And he and his group sort of travel across Europe, and they might not all have been Sabbateans, but he certainly was, and his partner in this enterprise, major Sabbatean believers, and they are headed toward Eretz Yisrael. they are going to make Aliyah as a group. And they do that. Everywhere they go, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid preaches and people join them, and they have a big following. It's not clear how many, hundreds, maybe thousands, a little unclear about how many of them there were, but they go as a group to Yerushalayim. They get to Yerushalayim, and Rabbi Yehuda Chassid dies. Pretty much the day they get there, or within a week or something like that, he dies. And the group is thrown into chaos. They reorganize. They start to build a synagogue. So if you've been in Yerushalayim, you're familiar with that synagogue. It's called the Chorva synagogue. It's a Chorva because it was destroyed afterwards, but it was the synagogue. It was the Beit Knesset of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid and his followers. Now, I've been there a number of times. I was there once or twice with tour guides. They will never tell you that this was a synagogue built
crazy
by a group that inspired by Shabbetai Ẓevi. Just
Wow.
It's part of the history, right? It's considered part of the prehistory of Zionism and part of the history of Eretz Yisrael. This big aliyah of people with Rabbi Yehuda Chassid going in the year 1700, right? They arrive in Yerushalayim, but between us, right? Most of this group, if not all, and certainly the leadership, were Sabbateans. Rabbi Avram Rovigo, that we were talking about a minute ago, from Modena, from Italy, goes and joins them around 1702 or 1703, something like that. He gets there. He is very quickly turned around to go and collect funds for the community, which is being just absolutely ransacked financially by the pasha, by the governor. So he goes back to Italy to collect funds. The leadership of the Jerusalem community falls into the hands of these Sabbateans, and eventually that becomes known in Europe, and funding is withheld from them, and the whole group falls apart. There's a whole history. Meir Benayahu, who is one of the great researchers of the Sephardic Jewry in general, and of the Sabbatean movement in particular, wrote an amazing article about this Rabbi Yehuda Chassid group in Sfunot Gimel Dalet, giving kind of the history from beginning to end. And then there's a scholar in Prague who wrote about that group when they were going through Prague. So there's a lot of scholarship about this movement of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, of these Sabbateans who go to Yerushalayim. Other groups, right, all over the place. And some of them are very radical. Some of them become completely heretical. They talk about Shabbetai Ẓevi as a god, and they right, all kinds of really, really wild stuff. And others are quite conservative, and sometimes it's the same person who sort of changes midstream and becomes far more radical. And sometimes it's not the person you expect. And sometimes the Kabbalistic views seem very, very radical and heretical, while the person who's writing them stays very observant and stays within the traditional Jewish community. Other times it goes the other way. So it's very confusing seeing why people continue to believe what it is that they believe, what it is they practice, how the belief goes with the practice. So this is all going on, and it continues for a very long time. This sort of chaotic following of Shabbetai Ẓevi continues well into the 18th century. You get various figures who kind of rekindle this, and one of them is a figure named Nehemiah Chia Chayun, who is an Ottoman Jew, a big Talmidei Hakhamim, very, very learned man and great Kabbalist. and big believer in Shabbatai, apparently, also seems to believe that he himself has a messianic identity, and he sort of comes through Europe. He's in Amsterdam, and then he goes further east in various places, and he causes an uproar because number one, he forged a book and claimed that it was his own. Well, he claimed that it was his own when it was not. And he got haskamot from various European rabbis under false pretenses. So he causes a huge ruckus. If anybody's interested in reading about this, Elisheva Karlibach's book, The Pursuit of Heresy, covers this whole period and some of these events. And this is the type of thing, right? Chayon is a big deal. There are other people, Shabtai Raphael and others who sort of show up on the scene, and they have various views about Shabtai and what to believe about him and so on. And then comes the next big wave connected with the Sabbatean movement. In 1726 is born in, I guess, Podolia, maybe, in far southern Poland, a guy named Yaakov Frank. It's not his original name, but he is born into a family that seems to be associated with the Sabbatean believers. And I don't want to go into him too much, but over the course of the 18th century, he becomes the big leader of the Polish Sabbateans. He kind of takes over the leadership, and he himself is a kind of a cult figure. And there's a novel that was very popular, published recently in English about him, and excellent study of him by Pavel Macheko. I don't want to go into the whole Frankist movement, which is somewhat different than the Sabbatean movement, but related to it. So you have, in the Ottoman world, you have these dönme, and in the Christian world, you have the Frankists. They essentially close themselves down. I believe it's 1819. The Frankist movement closes itself down and shuts down. It's not really quite the end of it, but the long and short of it, I guess this is the really long of it because I've gone on way longer than you wanted me, but
Oh, of course not.
the movement starts really in its very beginnings in 1648-49, when Shabbatai first sees himself as the Mashiach. It peaks in its public form in 1665-66, when it becomes well known, and then Shabbatai converts to Islam. And then it continues literally for centuries in this sort of underground or semi-underground form. And it takes all kinds of different shapes.
Yeah, I mean, there's also there was like a suspicious kind of vibe going on for a long time, where like big figures like Rav Yaakov Emden would accuse like Rav Jonathan Eibeshitz of being a Sabbatean because of certain amulets were written in a certain way that was Sabbatean. And there was always this suspicion, even at the rise of the Hasidic movement as some kind of revivalist movement. There's always this like feeling of distrust, I guess. So yeah, and also I think Shola mentions this in one of his books. I forget which one, but he mentions that like the Baal Shem Tov actually had a book that he really liked, Sefer HaZoref, which he didn't know was a Sabbatean book, or maybe he did, and that was part of, I guess it's part of the lore that shaped some of how he thought about the world, and that's why there's a lot of suspicion about him.
Right. So that's writings by Heschel Tzoref, who was an Eastern European Polish Sabbatean in the late 18th, the late 17th, the beginning of the 18th centuries, who's writing enormous writings that were, you know, a big part of at least Eastern European Sabbatean beliefs at that time, and circulated and so on. So they found their way into the collection of the Baal Shem Tov, who, according to Sholem at least, so the Baal Shem Tov talks about this figure of Adam Baal Shem, who's this sort of Baal Shem, and it appears that he's thinking of Heschel Tzoref, whose name, right? It's these writings. It's particularly interesting. The Baal Shem Tov was no Sabbatean, and Immanuel Etkes, one of our professors from the Hebrew University, who's written a tremendous amount about all of this, points out that the Baal Shem Tov apparently was very much affected by the Frankist movement and some of the crazy and horrifying things that they were doing, and really some of his activities and tefillot were really directed against the
he was against the movement,
the Frankists, and so on. But it shows you, it gives you a sense of how compelling some of these Sabbatean writings were.
Yes.
That the Baal Shem Tov found them so compelling that he saw them as being really important Kabbalistic writings. The Ramchal had writings of Nathan of Gaza. He also was not a Sabbatean, not a Sabbatean, but he was fascinated by these writings of Nathan of Gaza, which he owned, and people suspected him of being a Sabbatean, I guess, largely because he read this kind of work. People have discovered, major rabbis deep into the 18th century, and even maybe as far as the beginning of the 19th century, who were reading material because it was great Kabbalah. And part of what we can learn from that is that the Sabbatean aspects of this literature are so deeply hidden in certain formulations and certain ways of expressing things. To this day, there are books that, for example, there is the Sefer Chemdat Hayamim.
Oh, I own that.
Which is, a fascinating book about the Jewish holidays with a lot of minhagim and super interesting things that Rabbi Yaakov Emden, I believe, claimed that it was a Sabbatean work. And scholars in the 20th century went back and forth about whether there's actual evidence of this being Sabbatean. There seem to be certain things. Does that make the whole book unusable? What does that mean? So as an underground theology, the Sabbateans communicated their ideas in ways that you could read what they were writing and never recognize it as being Sabbatean unless you knew kind of the secret codes. That's the Yaakov Emden had such a hard time convincing people that this person or that person was actually a Sabbatean, because they would read the very same writings and they'd say, what are you seeing here that's a problem? And how do you explain to people that or she'esh bo kavana or she'ein bo kavana is actually a secret Sabbatean code that means, this or that? The famous example is his attack on Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, who you didn't hear it from me, and certainly you would never tell my rabbi that I said this, but I mean, the evidence is pretty much overwhelming. But there were all kinds of other people. But the war against the Sabbateans didn't go well. I've recently written a little bit about why people were afraid to attack them. It didn't go well for a lot of the people who pointed out who in the Jewish world in the early 18th century, which rabbis were still believers. Nobody wanted to hear it.
Interesting about this witch hunt, because there were always, like, let's say, opponents of the Zohar who make the same arguments that there's a lot of, there's, let's say, things that are messages in there that are, let's say, hidden, that are not necessarily Jewish origin, or they're Gnostic in nature, and there's arguments back and forth. I think what fascinating thing that we've discussed on our podcast previously was the letters between Rav Kapach and Rav Kook, and it's such an interesting history because it kind of, when you have texts like Gnostic texts, there's always the dubious origins of the texts, and then there's the people trying to pick apart like what's original, what's not original. It's a fascinating thing that just keeps kind of happening.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, the Sabbateans are sort of the fountainhead of a lot of that.
Of course.
you know, Professor, when listening throughout this podcast, it kind of gives like a dim view of, you know, the Messiah, like that we have, it's one of our 13 principles to believe in the coming of Mashiach. And it can get a little bit disheartening when you see all the crazy stuff that's gone on in the name of that Messiah. It just makes me personally appreciate a lot Maimonides, because all this craziness and all these problems and all these, you know, lives that get affected, you know, if honestly, if we just, you know, if we took Maimonides' understanding of the Messiah and we would apply it, we'd have no problems.
Right.
It's just
I disagree.
Ooh, let's hear it.
I'd love to hear why. Tell me.
I'll give you an example from the Shabbetai Ẓevi movement. The Rambam says that the Messiah is going to come in a natural manner, right? It's essentially, again, there's no difference between our days and the days of the Messiah, except Shi'ubud Malchuyot, that we won't be under the heel of other nations. And he says, for that reason, don't expect miracles. Don't expect to see miracles happening. Don't expect, you know, flash, bang, wow, and so on.
Right.
Somehow, Nathan of Gaza took this point and he said to people, don't ask Shabbetai Ẓevi to do magic tricks for you. Don't ask him to do a miracle for you, because look, the Rambam says that the Mashiach is not supposed to do miracles.
Let me rephrase. What you were countering was that the Maimonidean position can get abused, and you're 100% correct.
Correct.
No argument.
Right.
We're in agreement. What I was trying to say was, if we can actually, if we can delve into the Maimonidean outlook as a whole, a lot of these problems would disappear. If we took,
in other words, if all Jews were rationalists,
it would specifically when the idea of Messiah, which has affected so many people, so many lives, movements, and a lot of terrible things that have gone on in the name of Messiah, at least specifically to this point, I don't think there's an argument that it would be better off for this point. I'm not saying in general, but this point.
So what are you going to tell the Kabbalists?
They need to get a new job.
The Kabbalists, here's the key. The Kabbalists won. The rationalists, and as a friend of mine pointed out to me, in general, the whole sort of theological movement in Judaism lost. Metaphysics, right? Lost out. It's Kabbalah won.
And I think that
today we learned the Rambam for Halakha, but in yeshivas, I don't know where you might have learned, but they told me not to read the first prakim of the Rambam, Hilchot Deot, right?
Yesodei Torah, of course.
Yesodei HaTorah.
Yeah.
Right. Stay away from that stuff, and don't get involved in metaphysics. Don't, you know, just stick with halakha. Yeah. And meanwhile, under the table, while we weren't looking, the Kabbalists are everywhere. The Hasidim have spread Kabbalistic ideas everywhere. When you go to the Esnoga or the Shul or whatever it is you go to, before they take out the Torah, they're reading a big chapter of Zohar, right? Be'an Arachetz, right? B'rich Shmei D'marei Alma. That's the Zohar right there.
I won't argue.
Can you imagine what would the Rambam think of the way that we practice Judaism if he saw that our practices are full of Kabbalah?
I think that from the outset, the Rambam was always at a disadvantage, or at least a Maimonidean, which is not even specific to the Rambam. You can talk about Andalusia in general. Everyone at that time period in Spain, you had the Radak and the Ibn Ezra, and there was plenty, right? But there's a disadvantage because people naturally they gravitate towards to the fantastical. That is
Abstract.
the abstract, the fantastical, the mysterious.
That's right.
That's always going to play with human nature. 100%.
You can't be a fanatic moderate.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But
right.
I would say that with the advent of science and with the world,
skepticism
has made a comeback. There's it is back then, especially people did not have the information that today people have. But yes, we're always going to be dealing with that part of human nature, which is going to gravitate towards that. But we hope that eventually.
You walk into a farm store today, and now you're seeing more books from like Magid Publishing and more rational. I think in Israel, there's a lot of people are drawn to these ideas, but I don't think the thing is it's not a numbers game. Whether we say they won or didn't win,
that's true.
Judaism if you're looking at it as a microcosm, if it's about the numbers, Judaism lost because Christianity dominates the world and Islam dominates the world. Who cares about what the numbers are? Because it is always about Avram Avinu standing up against the rest of the world who believes in a lie, and he stands up for his beliefs. And for us, it's never about validating our beliefs based on how many people believe in something. And amongst all these different fragmented groups, they don't even agree with each other. So they may be Kabbalists, but they have different versions of the same story. And I think that what's important is having these conversations. We can kind of understand how these things originated, because the truth of the matter is the Kabbalistic movements, the Zohar and all these things, they all appeared after the time of the Rambam. There are anti-Maimonidean movements. In a way, by him writing the Mor Nevuchim, he kind of lit the match, and it backfired in a way. And this is all response to him. You could look at it that way. You could maybe choose not to, but the fact of the matter is these movements kind of took on a new life after, the Rambam's time. And we can't say it's unfortunate or it's fortunate. It's just what happened. And I think that it's important that we study, we're not telling people not to study Kabbalah, let's say, but to understand that, you have to know that you're playing with fire, and this is why even great Kabbalists say to people, don't study till you're 40 years old, wait till you're a certain age, wait till you have a certain amount of knowledge, because they understand that, these are ideas that you can take you completely off.
Which we just described for an hour and a half about what can happen. You know what I mean? So
it's particularly interesting to me that in the history of our people, it has tended to be the rationalist ideas, the Rambam and the followers of the Rambam, especially the Provençal school, who have been accused of heresy or of being dangerous to Jewish beliefs, and the Kabbalah has pretty much been embraced. I think it's because of Kabbalistic hyper halakhism. I don't know if that's a word I can use, but because Kabbalah puts this intense focus on doing the mitzvot and what they mean and their implications in all the olamot and so on, that has made it a palatable and even central part of Judaism, and it allows the ideas that go along with that to kind of slide. To not
can work
whereas
any calculation with those
right. As long as it's halachic, it gets through.
Yep.
Whereas rationalism, well, it's very dangerous. Look, if you think too abstractly about God, the way the Rambam describes, in the beginning of the Yad, well, you know, what kind of God could that be? What kind of relationship could you have to such an abstraction that you can't even talk about it in positive terms, and so on, right? That's very dangerous. So somehow rationalism became the dangerous thing, and Kabbalah became, you know, oh yes, that's beautiful, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that it's anthropocentric and that, you know, everything you do is actually causing things to happen in the universe, and it's not God who's causing it, it's us. There's a certain level of, you know, ego,
self-enhancement.
Yeah, it's a great feeling to know that what these little actions that you're doing are changing things. And yeah, I mean, I think that this is an important conversation because it's been happening for a very long time, and we are not here to tell people what to believe or not to believe, but to read books from people like yourself and Gershom Scholem and Rambam and Kabbalists, and to come to their own conclusions and to figure out what exactly is going on. So I appreciate, we both appreciate you coming on.
Really appreciate it.
And yeah, we're gonna hopefully send you a copy very soon, and we'll